Hello, I'm Kirstyn.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
The scene is set. You stand in the middle of a cool forest. Lines of identical trees planted in neat rows tower meters and meters above you. Their silvery bark and light green leaves create a beautiful light, and you're grateful for the shade from an unforgiving sun overhead. Yet, something feels odd about the forest, and you can't quite put your finger on why. Something just doesn't seem right about these trees here. They have been here for hundreds of years. But before this entire area was different. But was it better or was it worse? Hola, hermosos. Hoy vamos a hablar sobre un árbol invasivo muy interesante en Ecuador.
Slow down. It's like you're speaking some other language.
Just kidding. I'm not going to speak to you guys in Spanish this whole time. However, there is going to be a Spanish interview for whoever wants to listen to it. Or on YouTube, there's going to be an interview available with English subtitles because technology rocks. But anyway, hi, everybody. Nicholas, how are you today?
Hola, nerds. Yo no recuerdo nada. So I'm going to also speak in English because I understand Spanish, but I don't speak it well anymore.
Right. I thankfully have a pretty good level. Anybody who is a Spanish speaker and watches my interview, like, be nice to me because that's the first one I've ever done in Spanish. So there's a couple little stutters and slip ups, but I'm sure it's fine. But anyway, the reason that I started like that is the focus for this episode today is going to be in and around Ecuador. And I actually had a super great interview with one of the professors here that I'll introduce in a little bit. But anyway, to get started, the tree that we're going to take a look at is eucalyptus. Now, eucalyptus is a genus and a huge genus. I do understand that. We're going to narrow it down, but this genus has over 700 species of flowering trees, shrubs, and mallees. Before I really get into it, I want to share with you guys the ridiculous episode name brainstorming session I had with myself. So I think this one actually might be the real one, but I said gummin for first place. Eucalyptus trees are gum trees, guys.
That's the joke.
Now you've done and gum it. And then I went to I'm blue, dabu dee dabu die. I'm blue, but I'm a tree, not a guy. This was me the other day.
What? That's definitely not going to be the episode. That would be Could you imagine in the thumbnail that I would have to make for that? It would just be like a tiny little eucalyptus plant, and then like 90% of the thumbnail would just be the name of the episode.
I know. I was like, yeah, I don't know. It was an interesting day, me, myself, and I the other day. Working from home is great, most of the time. I'm sure everybody can resonate with me right now on that. Kind of stumps the creative process a little bit. Anyway, yes, gum trees or eucalyptus trees. Most of you are probably most familiar with this as, like one of the main food groups for koalas and these big trees in Australia, right?
Invasive koalas?
No, not yet. I mean, the koalas could, in theory, do well here in like the lower regions of Ecuador where it's warmer because there's so much eucalyptus for them. But that would be
yes, rewilding with introduced koala populations.
That is not recommended and literally the opposite of what we're trying to do here with this podcast. But everybody take that with a grain of salt. Yeah, but just a totally off the track side fact about koalas, like they sleep so much because eucalyptus has such a horrible nutritional value. So you have to eat a ton of it, but they sleep most of the time because they're just not getting any nutrients. So it's like, why would they eat it? And it's just because it's an unused niche, essentially. The koalas eat the eucalyptus because nothing really eats it. And this is, spoiler alert, part of what makes it such a good invasive species is there's very few things that like to eat it. It's just super unpalatable. But koalas are like, hey, no one's eating this. I don't care if it tastes like shit. I'm gonna have it.
It's funny you mention that because I'm pretty sure koalas feed their babies the excreted poop of eucalyptus and they eat it directly from the behind of the parent. So yeah, it does taste like shit.
That's disgusting.
That isn't even something I knew. That is incredible. Okay,
I'm very confident in that is an actual fact.
All right, we will put a confirmed or non-confirmed in the show notes, and we're just gonna write confirmed or non-confirmed, and people that have listened will know what that's talking about. Anyway, so yes, unpalatable, and apparently that's interesting. All right, so
Confirmed.
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 Oh my god, why are marsupials so gross?
Maybe humans just aren't gross.
Maybe, but we also are. I don't know. Anyway, I feel like we're.
I'm sure there's somebody who eats somebody's poop, but that's definitely not the content of this podcast.
I hope
It's more of a
not.
Joe Rogan Experience kind of podcast episode.
Yes, that would be something completely different. Anyway, if anybody's interested in that, Nicholas will do a small episode for you for buy me a coffee. He's shaking his head no at me and giving me a WTF face. Anyway,
For a small portion, for a small donation of a mere $20, I will do a full 30-minute episode on koala poop eating. So,
okay, everyone, you've heard the proposal. It's up to you now. Anyway, so if you guys are listening, you might have heard the term eucalypts. Now, this is eucalyptus, corymbia, and agnophora. But then we're going to be in the genus of eucalyptus, and then we're going to narrow that down mostly to one species that I'm looking at today, which is Eucalyptus globulus. And that is usually known as the blue gum trees. So that's the main one. If I'm talking about a different specific species, I'll let you guys know. But that's where we're going. So a little bit of a description if you've never seen it before. These are super fast growing and really hardy trees. And they're also extremely flammable, which is very interesting and something that we'll get into a little more later. Now, they're used for a whole bunch of different things. They're really useful for timber, for pulpwood, for honey production, and I'm sure people are familiar with them as essential oils and that they supposedly have some nice health and de-stressing benefits. So they're commercial for a lot of different things. Now, they get 45 to 50 plus meters tall. They are giant trees, and they're super, super skinny and really tall, and some of the forests that you're in, it just seems unrealistic, honestly, how crazy they get. Now, their flowers are either white or pink, depending on the species, and they have a lot of these really tiny petals, and they kind of look like fireworks, too. If you guys remember the description from the milkweed episode, they're kind of a similar type.
So what you're saying is they look like big balls.
Yes, exactly. They look like big pink balls hanging from a very tall tree. A very tall, skinny, very large tree.
Okay, now you're getting a bit too specific.
Cut. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I'm keeping it in.
No, I know. Okay. And then their fruit is like a hard, woody capsule. Okay, this is just a hard, woody capsule that is usually called a gum nut, which is not helping me. Now, the leaves are quite long, elongated. When they are younger trees, they're very, very silvery white. I swear it almost looks like they're spray painted sometimes. When they're quite young saplings, they're beautiful. And as they get a little bit older, the leaves get a little bit darker, but they're really quite nice colors. And they, in the scene is set, I always say that because if you're in a forest of eucalyptus, you get just this like extra silvery green light, as opposed to, a lot of us have been in some kinds of deciduous forests, and that sort of light that shifts through the trees, but I swear it's just like distinct. So they're beautiful trees, really. Now, they're super hardy, like I said. They live in places in Australia and Tasmania that are super dry. And realistically, these trees should be dry deciduous. They should be trees that drop their leaves when it's super dry because of the places they live in, but they keep their leaves year round. And then they're also super tolerant to fire. And on that aspect, they're also really flammable. So when you hear about like these really big forest fires in Australia and things, it's because the eucalyptus is really really flammable, but it goes through, it helps them reproduce, just like a ton of other trees like conifers and stuff as well. Yeah, so
Conifers?
that's essentially a decent description. Do you have an image in your mind, Nicholas, of a eucalyptus?
Yeah, and I think just to clarify a little bit, because it was kind of contradictory, or it sounds contradictory the way
Right.
that it was said, but essentially what Kirstyn is saying is that the trees are very flammable, meaning that they go up very easily, but they're tolerant insofar as they recover very, very well from the fire and it helps proliferate them. If
Right,
that wasn't
exactly.
necessarily clear as before, just so that like people aren't like, I don't understand how they're both flammable but also fire resistant. So
Right. No,
yeah,
for
that
sure, it's
was
good.
the clarification there. But yeah, no, I have a pretty good picture of the trees. In my head, I'm kind of picturing like, I guess, rhododendron and like at least like that type of tree in sumac, where it's not necessarily like dense foliage that you would get from like the more temperate deciduous trees, but probably like less foliage and something like that. I mean, I can always
Right. Yeah,
Google
I
it,
mean, they
but
still get like a
from your
decent amount,
description.
but I know what you mean. Like, it's not like an oak tree where like the leaves are just like completely blot out everything and they're gigantic, but they still have, and because they have these like elongate, skinny leaves, it kind of gives a little bit of a different effect as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they sound beautiful to me.
They are, and that is again something that we're going to kind of touch on a little bit later, which is kind of an interesting social dynamic to invasive, quote unquote, invasive eucalyptus, right? So, nice trees. If you didn't catch it already, where are they from? They're from Australia, and the neat part is almost every state in Australia has like a distinct type or distinct species of eucalyptus. So the ones that I'm talking about, mostly the Eucalyptus globulus, the blue gum is from southeastern Australia. And then, of course, like we talk about a lot, is there actually a lot of them are threatened in their native ranges, just mostly because of logging and also because of just increased frequency of forest fires. Because with climate change and these increased fires and dryness that we're seeing, even plants that are quote unquote fire tolerant or even like pyrophiles, sorry, that love fire are not even being able to recover because these fires are so intense or so different as well.
Yeah, and to just expand upon that a little bit, there's a couple reasons why. Well, there's multiple reasons why the fires that are happening now are becoming more detrimental to the native fire tolerant species, and that's because one of the frequency, because if you hit something with fire in a repeated manner, it will cause damage to it in the long term, even if it's something that's tolerant, because naturally, even though fires might occur there, they don't occur with that level of frequency, so the plants can't necessarily fully recover. Furthermore, with the reduction in indigenous burning practices and traditional burning and things like that, and fire suppression, more materials get built up, therefore causing much hotter fires, which then, of course, are far more hot than what they would naturally be and are therefore detrimental to the native plants, because if you have a fire that runs through with just herbaceous material, it'll get hot but only on the surface. If you have years and years and years of built up woody, dry, dead material, that fire can get so hot that it actually causes the ground to become infertile. So yeah, it's a multitude of different reasons why, but yeah, it's pretty crazy to think that just because of reductions in traditional burning practices and native burns and things like that, that it can cause problems even to the fire tolerant species.
Right. Yeah, the fire suppression and all those things are really complicated. Thankfully, I think a lot of places, at least that I've seen, you're seeing a lot better fire practices and those kind of things. My good friend and collaborator, Rob Nelson, he does Untamed Science. If you guys aren't familiar, he has a super good little series on forest fire on YouTube. If you guys want something with like a little bit of visuals and stuff, he did a super cool one that explains the whole process. And I always share that one a lot when I'm talking about forest fires. So Nicholas just explained it beautifully, but there's real fire, so it's fun to watch.
Yes.
All right. So where is it listed as invasive then? So up until now, I've always relied on the Global Invasive Species Database through the IUCN. And interestingly, eucalyptus is not there. But what you can find are the pests of eucalyptus. So this is something that we're going to get into that's super interesting. So you have eucalyptus rust, which is Puccinia seedii, and then you have a weevil that is known as the eucalyptus weevil or the eucalyptus snout beetle, gum tree weevil, and this one is Gonipterus scutellatus. So these guys are what is more research. If you look up invasive and eucalyptus on like Google Scholar or in either Spanish or in English, you're getting mostly people talking about the pests on them, which is because it is economically important, which we're going to get to later. So the focus is not actually on eucalyptus being a problem, it's the problems with eucalyptus. So this is why I picked this one, because we're getting controversial today.
My favorite type of thing to get.
That was creepy.
Let's get controversial.
That's a great. We could put that as a like the subheader for this. Let's get controversial.
Right. Yeah, that whole "I'm blue, dabba dee, dabba die," that full thing, and then we will also follow that up with "Let's get controversial," part 2, electric boogaloo.
All right. So where I did end up finding is there was this Manual de Plantas Invasoras, which is just like a manual of like invasive plants that was actually done as part of a postgrad course. That was a super, super neat little reference. And of course, I checked it with a couple other places. But so where I did find that it was invasive is in other parts of Australia, in South America, in China, Spain, United States, in California and Hawaii, in France, India, the Canary Islands, Italy, Jamaica, big breath, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Portugal, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. So it's pretty spread out. Now, this has all mostly been like purposeful introductions as well, which we'll get into, but those are all the places where it's quite prolific now as well. So I'm going to just explain a little bit more of the broad issues, and then I'll get into a specific case study today instead of kind of doing the reverse. So why is blue gum such a good invasive? As we said already, super fast growing. It handles drought and fire really well. So if there's any kind of pressures that come through an area, it can bounce back. There's not many things that eat it. Like we mentioned, it's super unpalatable, so it doesn't get decimated by even like really prolific plague species. And people have planted it like crazy for forestry and reforestation. So that also makes it a really good invasive that people have planted it in really large areas in a lot of places. So our introduction has made it more invasive itself. And then you also have allelopathy, which we've mentioned before, where plants negatively impact other plants by releasing biochemicals into the environment. So I always think of like the resins in pine needles that turn the soil acidic and other plants can't grow. It's the same deal with eucalyptus. Now, it's not quite, I'm not sure if it's quite as strong as pine trees because you still see like quite a bit of grasses and stuff growing under them, but it is harmful towards a lot of other types of native plants.
Maybe a better comparison then would be walnuts. Typically, walnuts will kind of promote other woody plants from growing around it, but it seems as though the herbaceous plants are pretty successful around the base of walnuts. It's not like when you see a walnut tree growing or anything like that, that it seems to be just kind of on its own, similar to pine trees like you were mentioning, where you'll walk into those massive pine stands and there's virtually no plants underneath them. In the case of walnuts, their allelopathy is a lot less dramatic. So it's probably similar to that if I had to take a guess for anyone who, you know, is familiar with walnut allelopathy.
Right. That's a great, yeah, thanks for the additional example. That's helpful. I'm just like from the Yukon, so all I ever think about is pines.
Lucky you.
It's beautiful. Anyway, so to back that up, there was a study from a different eucalyptus, but Eucalyptus camaldulensis, which is also a really prolific tree, the red gum. So this like severely hindered aloe vera growth in plantations and in other places. And then another one in Pakistan with the same one using wheat, like wheat couldn't grow near the eucalyptus. And then with blue gum, there is studies in the references there that show allelopathy killing lots of plants around it as well. So it kicks butt. Not only does it use up a lot of resources, I did forget to mention that it uses a lot of water. So it does also help to compete out with other plants. And it also grows back after being cut. If you cut down a eucalyptus, it sprouts literally from the same spot. It's an incredible tree. Like it's almost more of a shrub that just got really, really tall as opposed to the traditional sort of tree that we normally think of. Okay, so in a general sense, what are the issues? And then we'll break it down into a couple case studies. So it's a great competitor, killing off all the other native plants. And then it reduces a variety of food and habitat, right? So like anything, if a tree comes through and takes over an area, it gets rid of the heterogeneity of vegetation. So having a bunch of different levels of and different types of native plants, right? So if you have less types of plants, less types of food, less layers, then you as well hurt the biodiversity of the fauna as well. There has been some things quoted, which this is controversial too, so we're going to get to this later, but the allelopathy makes for less vegetation around it, which can cause some erosion, right? So what we're going to hold on about this is that a lot of people talk about how the eucalyptus has these really insane taproots and these awesome root structures that they help keep a ton of the soil in, so they are making up for the plants they get rid of. So there's a couple people that I'll quote for that later on. And then again, it uses a ton of water and it's really tolerant to fire, but it catches fire super easily, as we mentioned. So in places where maybe forest fires aren't normally as frequent, they might be more frequent with a bunch of eucalyptus. That is just a really great fuel. This is actually cited in the manual where the different eucalyptus is invasive, that in South American countries, it has been claimed as a reason for propagating fires more quickly and more intensely. So this is causing problems as well for both flora and fauna, right? Because if you're constantly getting big fires through here and getting kicked out, that's not good. I want to really quickly touch on a neat case study in California, and then we're going to dig right into the one in Ecuador for the interview that I did. So in California, it's really interesting because it was really a symbol of culture and economic importance here. So in California, there was a bunch of eucalyptus in a few key islands and some places, and it's a really beautiful tree that makes a great forest. Now, there's this interesting paper by Nunez and Simberloff, 2005, that talked about this issue that they refer to as a cultural keystone species. This is super neat. So this is a species that is ingrained in the culture and it's important culturally and economically. So it's not a keystone species in the way that we talk about an otter is a keystone species because it has a larger effect on the environment versus its like small numbers, right? But this is just a term that they coined to talk about things that we take care of in our environment or that have an impact more culturally and economically. So it's kind of neat. I see Nicholas looking doubtful and puzzled, but I'm not sure what you think about it.
That's just my default I'm thinking and processing face. So
yeah, it was a super neat little paper. That one is in the references there if anybody wants to take a look. So I know 2005, it's a little bit ago, but I just came across it for this and I thought it was super interesting. So they talked about that example was the eucalyptus in California, bananas in Ecuador. Bananas are everything here. Like plantains and bananas are used for so many different dishes and cultural, really important Ecuadorian foods. And it's technically an invasive species too that was brought over, but it has been here so long and so ingrained in the culture that it's the same. And coffee in Colombia as well. Coffee is not actually native there, but now it is everywhere. And it is, what do you think of when you think of Colombia? You think of, I mean, beautiful
cocaine.
Views and a bunch of, and yes, and cocaine maybe, but that is a problem in a lot of South America. Thank you, Nicholas, for that very educated comment.
Well, I was just wondering if the coca leaves were also considered an invasive species.
Right.
So
I would have
I wasn't making a cocaine. I was making a cocaine joke, but I was also segueing into my curiosity of one, I don't know where like coca is native to. So I'm not sure if that would also be an example. But yes.
I guess we can check that. That could be a future episode. I'm having fun with South America. So Yeah. Oh, and the other one he used is horses in the Americas. Like we did have horses in the Americas, obviously, but then they did go extinct. And then the horses that got brought over by the Spanish and the English are so incorporated into even our native cultures that you can't. It's hard for us to even imagine not having horses, right? So it's just a super neat concept. But anyway, eucalyptus was considered like a cultural keystone species in California because they had these islands and there was this big project to go ahead and remove all these eucalyptus and replant native trees. And there was a huge pushback from these people that made an organization that was Save Our Eucalyptus. Because to them, eucalyptus had always been there. And eucalyptus was this like really important part of their culture. But the people that were there were trying to restore the natural habitat. So I thought this was an interesting case study because you have, people coming in and try to change it. But if people love something, then it makes a whole different challenge. Like biologically, invasive species are super complicated. And then you come along and have people that want to keep them there because they really care about them. And it's just a whole another complication. So I think this is a decent time to take a little break. I'm not sure if it's too early, but we'll do that. And then I'm going to talk about Ecuador in a little bit.
Be right back. Thank you for joining us for the first half of this episode of The Anthropocene. We're going to take a short break.
The Anthropocene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes. All right, welcome back, everybody.
Welcome back. I know you hate it when I do it all creepy like that, so.
I do hate it. Throwing me off my game here. All right. I hope everybody's feeling refreshed and ready to rock. So we are going to get to Ecuador, and I know I have done the Galapagos already, but guess what? I'm living in Ecuador now, so when I think about invasive species, I'm focusing on stuff here right now. So the introduction here was in 1860. So this was a while ago. So there is a couple different species that were introduced, but again, I'm going to focus on the blue gum. Now, it covers super broad regions of the Andes, which is the high mountain regions right through Ecuador. It's like the Cordillera that runs through Ecuador and Peru, part of Colombia there. And now, yeah, it's a huge area that is planted on purpose, and also ones that, oh, Nicholas, are you frozen?
No, I'm thinking.
Oh. I was so sure you were frozen. Okay, we can keep that in there if you want.
Yeah, just an intense listener is all.
Okay. I thought you were frozen. Anyway, sorry. So it covers really big regions here because it was introduced and planted, and then also there's some that has obviously escaped and is starting to grow quite prolifically in a bunch of different areas. So in Ecuador, it is of huge economic importance. So this is a tricky one, and this is what made me so interested in it. So the first time I actually thought about this subject was way before I even knew I was starting a invasive species podcast. And I was actually on a horseback riding tour that goes through one of the parks in the south here. And we were talking about the eucalyptus with not even a biologist, but the guy that leads the tours. And he was talking to me about the fact that it's kind of a shame that there's so much eucalyptus here, but it's better than nothing, because before this got brought in, there was nothing here. The deforestation in Ecuador was just detrimental, and then they brought in the eucalyptus and it grew really quickly, and now there's forests again. So this was mentioned to me by this gentleman, and then I've had it brought up other times as well afterwards, more with biologists and other people that I've discussed with. So this is something that's been like kind of fermenting in the back of my brain little by little. Yeah, so then funny enough, when I started to actually research it specifically for this podcast, every time I looked for it, it just comes up the invasive weevil that's causing problems for the eucalyptus because it's economically harmful. So I'm just throwing a number out my butt here, but like 80% of the papers that you see are looking at the weevil, the invasive weevil that also came with the eucalyptus and is decimating the eucalyptus, which it's one of the only things, along with koalas, that eat it because it's super unpalatable. But weevils are adorable, and they're also super good plagues, and they're really, really bad pests. So There is a super interesting mix of people fighting against eucalyptus and also people fighting for it, of course, because it's this like intersection of like socioeconomic and ecology. There was a article I found with El Comercio, which is like a really famous newspaper here, about the negative effects of eucalyptus, which was cool, on erosion and the propagation of fire. And it was neat because I'm reading this article and I get to the bottom and there was actually a comment from the director of communication of the Ministry of Agriculture here that said, hold up a second, El Comercio, like I have a comment for this. And they printed it in the online version of the newspaper about the eucalyptus actually being beneficial and that all these problems that we're seeing are more due to poor forestry management and poor agriculture. But if we start to better manage the eucalyptus, then it's not going to cause these problems, especially fire, because most of the fires that happen are caused by people, right? So there was like kind of this counter argument. And then he also said too, against the fact that it's really decimating native biodiversity, that there's at least 300 bird species that you find in these forests that do super well in eucalyptus, which is kind of a minor rebuttal to the biodiversity loss. But yeah, it's super interesting. Anyway, so after I did a little bit of digging around, I did an interview with Alvaro Barragan, who is a professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica Ecuador, commonly known as La Católica here. So I've done a little bit of work there with a different professor in entomology and cross paths with Alvaro, and I know he's super passionate about eucalyptus. So it was really awesome for him to do this interview with me. They were super busy, so I'm really grateful for him to take that time. And then if anybody understands Spanish, there is a bonus episode here where you can listen to that. It also has a Spanish and an English transcript. And then on my personal YouTube channel, I am going to throw up a link and you can select to have English subtitles. So there's an option for you guys to listen to the full interview if you are curious. Anyway, so he's a specialist in entomology, but he's worked a lot on the pests of eucalyptus, these weevils, and is super knowledgeable biologist. So our conversation started with me asking a little bit about how it's economically important in Ecuador. And interestingly, so before eucalyptus came, Ecuador didn't really have great lumber because Ecuador has a range of really beautiful native trees, but they do not grow tall. And part of that is, you know, in the Andes, you got like lots of rocky soil. I mean, in the Amazon, of course you do, sorry. In the Andes of Ecuador, you know, you get really high winds, you get lots of fog, rockier soils, kind of rougher conditions. And most of the trees are just shorter. So before eucalyptus came along, there was never a building that was more than 3 floors. Like you just had like really low construction, mostly bricks, mud, and things that were built with wood couldn't be very much just because there wasn't the lumber available, right? And then the eucalyptus comes along, which gets to like 50, 60 meters tall, and you can all of a sudden go ahead and build these amazing trees. So how was it introduced? So he went ahead and told me that it spread worldwide. Like I said, Africa, Europe, North and South America, all the places I mentioned, around this same time when people started to realize these incredible growth abilities and tolerance of this tree. Because of course you're going to see this tree that grows super tall and is really tolerant, and you're going to want to plant it everywhere. So here they use it for burning wood, for furniture, fences, flooring, and they're starting to use it for paper pulp as well, and they're exporting it to places like Japan. So it is super, super versatile. And then we get some ecosystem services from eucalyptus actually here around Quito. So mostly in the form of, again, avoiding erosion, especially around the places in the cities, in the Andes where there's lots of construction around the mountains. So in Quito specifically, it's a really neat city. If you guys have a chance to like go on Google Earth and check it out, it is just plunked right between 2 mountain ranges, and it just goes super, super long. It's like the longest, like least wide city you've ever seen in your life. It's very skinny and really long. And so of course the result of this is you get people That was subtle. So you get people building up into the mountains, right? Because eventually you run out of space. So you build up into the mountains, but without having these forests along the top of those houses or some underneath, then you can just get these crazy landslides, especially because here when it rains, it pours, and it does for quite a while. So this is an ecosystem service of eucalyptus, and a lot of biologists claim that the eucalyptus just has these incredible roots that really, really hang on to the dirt. So they're helping out, right? Maybe the native plants could do better, but it's hard to say right now because we don't have them. And before the eucalyptus was brought in, this whole area around Quito, around Cotopaxi National Park, which is a place that's nearby, was just completely deforested. It was like a total desert, is what they say. It was really decimated. So then at one point, the president, Garcia Moreno, he saw a great opportunity and said, hey, this tree grows really amazing. Let's use it to reforest these areas and then like start a valuable economic resource. So like, in all fairness, he was doing what he thought was right. And then as well, now we know like a little bit better and we want to protect our native diversity. However, it's completely getting rid of these trees, like all of the eucalyptus, isn't necessarily viable or a really good idea because of how it's used. Because think about it in this way. This is what we talked a lot about, me and Alvaro, is so imagine that we go ahead and we get rid of all the eucalyptus and we plant it with slower growing native trees, and then we're cutting these important native trees down for lumber instead. So that's something to take kind of with a grain of salt, right?
Plus, I think also like one of the things you get into with management, especially at that scale, is you've got a tree that is growing larger than native trees and occupying essentially a completely untouched niche, creating an entirely new habitat. And if you go in and just wipe out that habitat, then I feel like it would have potentially a lot of negative connotations on the existing wildlife. I mean, regardless of what, the eucalyptus has pushed out because of its presence, now it's been here for so long at this point, it's become naturalized and created new ecosystems. Completely erasing it from ecosystems could be even more detrimental than just letting it stay.
Exactly. So essentially what we talked a ton about is finding this balance, right? Because yeah, of course in the protected areas, we need to be making sure that there's not a ton of eucalyptus invasion. But why would I take a eucalyptus plantation, cut it all, put native trees that are going to grow half as quickly, that are going to be half as tolerant to rough conditions, and then cut down the native trees instead, right? So this is why I thought it was so interesting. The one thing that we did talk about that was interesting, so we talked a little bit about why eucalyptus is such a, good invasive, and it's all the things that I mentioned to everybody before. But something interesting we talked about with the allelopathy is this is a very new idea that's not like been proved with literature yet, but they're starting to think that these chemicals in the allelopathy are actually having negative effects on the native amphibians and that they might be poisoning the amphibians as well. So this is a newer idea that people are coming out to study now, but keep your eye out for that because that I think was super interesting and a whole nother level of impacts on the native biodiversity.
That's
right.
very
Yep.
interesting. Like that's just
Yeah.
like this is incredibly interesting to consider and think about. And I don't think it's necessarily akin to like cedar and pine and conifers being toxic to reptiles, because I think that is more about the ecotoxicology of like the actual makeup of their sap and things like that, as far as I know. But I do
Mhm.
know that there is like a toxic element to that to a lot of reptiles where they can't be around like pine needles or pine forests, or like, for example, if you house reptiles and were to put them on pine wood, they would get blisters and it would actually like be super detrimental to them. But that's super interesting. I almost feel like I've heard some people say something about the allelopathy being negative or negatively impacting the frogs, but that I'm eager to read any new studies and research that comes out regarding that.
Right, for sure. It'd be super interesting. And just thinking about how amphibians in general are such like a sensitive species that, they absorb a lot of things through their or sensitive species, a sensitive group of organisms.
I'm sensitive, Aubrey!
They absorb things through their skin quite easily. So, I mean, if something is pumping enough toxic biochemicals into the ground to keep out other plants, what's to say it's not getting into upper levels of soil, into water, and impacting? I'm not sure if it's, if it's egg stage, if it's tadpole, if it's adult, or all of them, but it's logically it makes sense. So now we just have to go ahead and test it. I think it's a super neat hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
So could be hurting the frogs, which would suck here because the frogs in Ecuador, it's incredible. Like the biodiversity here is really cool. If anybody's ever curious, there's a page called BioWeb, which is also through the La Católica, and they have just all the frogs that they've been able to identify, and they have photos and their habitat and their range and stuff. We are recently working on the invertebrates one, but it's slow. So we have a couple ants so far, but go ahead and check that out if you guys are curious.
And also
Right,
check
so-
out our episode on ants.
Yes, don't forget to check out the ant episode. They are good little guys that are causing big problems. I was very conflicted doing that episode because I love ants, but man, our little fire ants just so nasty. Anyway, so on that note, we have a bunch of these, we have the economic value of eucalyptus, and then you have the problems that it could be causing and the habitat disruption. So I asked a little bit about what kind of recuperations there are. And in one of the parks here that's called Metropolitano, which is one of the biggest parks in the city, there is a ton of eucalyptus. And I thought that's all there is there. But apparently in different areas, they've been slowly taking it out and replacing it with native plants, and it looks great. But most of the projects are private. It's people with land who have bought up land, and they have, these private reserves, and they're replacing these forests with native plants, and they're taking care. So on like a governmental scale, there's not like a huge effort going towards this yet, but it's little by little, you can see that people are starting to really want to change this out. Something else that we talked about that was neat that I wanted to bring up was kind of the baseline memory of people, which is the same idea as this cultural keystone species from California. Because here, for pretty much everybody that I talk to right now that's alive in Ecuador, eucalyptus has been here since they were born, since before they were born, since their grandparents, right? So again, it's kind of naturalized. Like you said, it's part of this ecosystem now. And these, the forests all around Pichincha, this province that I live in, it's eucalyptus. And it is a beautiful tree, and it's been here forever. So it's just such a complex, really neat problem. And then, of course, as well, with all ornamental
and
plants.
I think it's...
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. I think there's a delay also on a recording, so
Oh, okay.
that's why we're talking over each other this episode a little bit more. So apologize in advance to the listeners, but we might be interrupting each other
Right.
more frequently on this episode. But I was going to say it brings into light a super important cultural aspect of things, because it's easy from an outside perspective to be like, no, you don't need that lumber. It's not necessarily important. You have to preserve the biodiversity of that area, which is a very, to be blunt, privileged thing to say. And it's kind of a parachute science to come in and be like, oh, well, we have to restore these to preserve the ecosystems. Well, the ecosystems there have been functioning with this eucalyptus for hundreds of years now. At this point, it's not necessarily how do we eradicate it, but how do we still preserve the cultural significance of it while also preserving what biodiversity has been able to adapt to the presence of the eucalyptus. So I think that's something to remember, because I think that a lot of people get caught up being from different parts of the world. It's easy to say, oh, we should absolutely do it this way, when in reality, it's a lot more intricate and needs a lot more thought and planning to implement the actual management. So that would be
Right.
my soapbox for the episode, is to just be aware that, like, yeah, it's not always just a cut and dry thing.
No, exactly. And even here, because something that Alvaro said a lot to me that was interesting is, a lot of the biologists here really kind of demonize the eucalyptus. They're like, oh, the eucalyptus is blah, 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 and all these things. But even within the same culture, there's barriers as well to people living in the city, and then people who live, you know, in the high Andes, it gets cold here. Like, I know people that think about Ecuador, like you probably think of the beaches and the Amazon, but in the Andes, like it's, you know, like 7 degrees Celsius at night, and it's cold. Like, if you don't have indoor heating, or you don't have you know, I don't have indoor heating, you have tons of blankets, but you heat yourself up with a fire at night. And is it better to be cutting down native trees, or should they be having a forest of eucalyptus that is, so, you know, reserved for lumber, right, as well? So yeah. And then also too, talking a little bit about the cultural aspect is, you know, there is also these things around, which we've mentioned before, especially in the grass episode, around how we have these ornamental plants that we think are really beautiful because they're not ours, right? So changing the ideas a little bit from what are weeds, what are beautiful native plants, because the trees here that are native are kind of stubbier and shorter, right? So it's not the same kind of thing. But I did actually mention you, Nicholas, in the interview, how you're always talking about somebody saying, "Oh, that's a bunch of weeds over there," and you're like, "Those are native grasses." So just we talked about that the most difficult thing about the management practice is changing cultural mindsets, as opposed to the actual pulling out eucalyptus and putting something else in.
Right.
Yeah, and so we finished off the conversation essentially saying that it's best to coexist with the eucalyptus as a resource, and just make sure that we're better controlling the use of it and not letting it escape out of controlled areas. So in the national parks that have still, like, you know, a quote unquote pristine sort of forest, like, we really need to make sure that we're not getting eucalyptus invading these areas and kicking out the native plants, but also keeping eucalyptus in the areas where it is being used economically, right? So especially because a huge barrier to switching to non-native plants is they know nothing about the native plants and how to use them. So here, there's everything about eucalyptus: how long does it grow, how to grow the seeds, best management practices, blah blah blah. But it takes a lot of work to go ahead and see if the native plants are feasible to use economically in the same way. So they're starting to work on that, and they see that there are some species that would be viable, but we all know that science takes time and a lot of resources, and a lot of people that are going to be funding you are probably going to say, well, what we have is fine. So barriers to science, mostly money and a little bit of culture. Right. So kind of on the bright end of that interview, we are starting to value our native biodiversity more. The young biologists and young people here are really seeing that, you know, we have to keep eucalyptus out of pristine areas and do our best to have more native forests, but don't satanize it. Like, do not demonize the eucalyptus either, and try to find a way to, like, coexist essentially with it. The balance is key. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Which goes along with pretty much ecology in general.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we're here. I mean, as much as us as biologists and ecologists and stuff, we're really trying to find our way to, like, lower our footprint, which we always should be doing. Humans are living here. We need resources. You know, we're not going anywhere anytime soon. So how can we find a way to, unfortunately, yes. Yeah. That's a whole nother, I don't know, 5-part episode on humans as an invasive species. Those are pretty much what the anthroposnips are most of the time. It's just, like, interesting anthropogenic
On
effects.
this episode of Anthroposnips, people still fucking suck.
Oh god, yes. But people don't have to suck is my maybe over optimistic ecologist point, that we know we can find a way to do sustainable resource extraction and find a way to still keep building the things we need to do and eating the things we need to eat and making it work. That's my optimist soapbox for today. Awesome. So just to wrap it up really quick, because it wouldn't be a episode if I didn't, what are some control methods? Just if anybody's curious. So the seeds don't last very well for more than a year. This was sort of the same thing as the milkweed as well. So if you can clean them up before they have a chance to germinate, it really helps. And then the trees do grow back from their trunks, as I mentioned before, so they can't just be cut down, but there is some papers referenced below. They say you can cut and then use herbicide, so kind of that combo cut and spray. And then in California, they essentially did manually cutting down to the roots and just like really messing up the tree, like just really mangling the roots and the base, and that seemed to go ahead, and then applying herbicides. So they just got a bunch of really angry people.
Right. So under control methods, it just says just fuck them right up.
I really wanted to do that. I just said just really messing them up, but yeah, I went with the PG version. Regrets. Exactly. So it's just really destroying the base and the roots that they can usually grow back from. And then a control method in terms of our coexistence is just having good buffer zones around lumber areas, right? So if you have like a stretch of forest that's used for lumber, to have sort of a buffer zone where before a native forest, so that you're not getting as much eucalyptus like seeds like blowing over and growing there. So I don't know whether that's agriculture or you kind of have just a zone of like a no plant zone that's sort of a no man's zone there, but just a region where you won't get the eucalyptus coming into the native areas. Yeah, and that was about it. Not really a control method, but they did mention that, or something that's really interesting that people have brought up here is the winds get super crazy because we are at like 2,800 meters above sea level. It's like 9,000 feet here. So the winds sometimes just get crazy. So these really tall trees get blown over like crazy sometimes, especially because native trees grow stubby and short because they're up in the mountains. But so you kind of get this as a safety issue as well as kind of a management problem where they have to be cut down before they get too crazy tall. And then as well, they don't do so well with really clay or phosphorus soils. So maybe those areas could be focused on more as keeping native, and then you have your lumber yard somewhere else. And then a lot of fog, which is weird because it's like always foggy here because it's, the Andes. But anyway, yeah, so summary and good news. There's a big shift happening and everybody's starting to love their native plants a lot more. There's still a long way to go, right? So, and then also with eucalyptus, we need to kind of keep them to some extent, right? Which leads to this kind of more gray debate round than normal that I have for today. So let's get into it. Are you ready?
Cool. Let's do it.
All right. So do you have any
Now it's my turn. Yeah, I have a few. I think we kind of discussed them and talked about them a little bit, but we can definitely re-highlight them just so it's clear to the listeners and that we're making a specific reference to these potential arguments against their removal and the control of that. So I guess the first one would be like, obviously we talked a lot about how economically important this tree is. So if we cut these trees down and remove them, isn't that going to directly affect and harm the economy?
So yes. So this one I'm gonna if you go ahead and just remove all these trees, it does hurt the economy. However, in places where it is not directly being harvested for lumber, for wood, for paper, the removal is definitely 100% important. So in any areas where it's not specifically being used, and I mean in the areas here in the hills where it's being used as erosion and things, it could be replaced by native plants and do perfectly good. So my answer is a yes and a no. Yes, anywhere where it's not being used economically, it needs to be removed and replaced, but I think it needs to stay where it is being used actually. So
okay. So before eucalyptus had established, arguably there was more detrimental things from just the deforestation of the slower growing native trees and plants and things like that. So this faster growing eucalyptus that grows larger, that would arguably reduce deforestation. Isn't that more beneficial to keep those trees than to just revert back to the traditional methods, or not necessarily the traditional methods, but the previous methods of deforestation that were taking place.
Right. So, I mean, retrospect is always 2020, and I think it would have been great at the time of reforestation that we had known better and used native plants right away, especially in the areas that are national parks, that are the hillsides around Quito, and that kind of thing. So, I think if little by little we can go through and remove these eucalyptus and put in native plants, it's 100% better because that is the original ecosystem. No matter how much it is naturalized or how much it's culturally integrated. Like, personally, I just think we should do our best to get it back to the way it was, right? It's just, it would have been great if we had known better before, but that's with a lot of things. Like, science is getting better and changing every day, right? So yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned then that we would be getting back to the way it was. One of the things that is a super modern problem and is something that didn't occur necessarily before is climate change. With the, advent of climate change and the changing of global temperatures and things like that, couldn't these more tolerant trees be this new naturalized area? I mean, they've been here for, 200 years, like you said, and or more. And, if that's the case, then these naturalized trees might be a better ecosystem, or at least the foundation of a better ecosystem than the formerly native trees, which might not be as prevalent anymore, or might not do so well with the increase in climate change.
Right. So this is like such a complicated point because yeah, with climate change, a lot of invasive species are doing so much better, right? Because they're creeping into like more northern areas or into higher slopes that are used to be colder, and the native plants can't handle the drought and they can't handle the fire. So maybe this is one of those things where we should coexist, and we should be having some native plants and some of the eucalyptus forests as well. But at the end of the day, we just need to really, try our best with the native plants, and we need to do everything we can as humanity to try to finally get a little bit of a hold on climate change. And that maybe is just like a cop out answer for me to just say, well, we need to get a hold on this, but that, I think, needs to be our first step. And then, taking these areas that we can and planting native diversity, and in theory, a lot of the native biodiversity will help us with better ecosystem services that can help to also mitigate climate change. So let's do what we can to restore our native species, and we got to get a handle on this, guys.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of the difficulties that ecologists and biologists face when looking at ecological restoration and preservation, because you've got these cultural significances that need to be addressed, the biological changes, climate change as a new factor that we still don't fully understand the repercussions of what it's having on our ecosystems. Also, 200 years ago, we probably didn't have the best records of what this natural ecosystem necessarily was. We can use examples of remaining natural ecosystems today, of course, but things fluctuate, things change, and undoubtedly some of the habitat that was present 200 years ago may be completely lost, and we have no idea what that's like. So that adds another unknown factor on top of that. So this is honestly a great episode to see, people who aren't necessarily directly engaged in restoration, the difficulties that we as ecologists face in preserving and restoring these ecosystems when there's so many factors going against their restoration and preservation. So we obviously need to do, like you said, at any level the best we can to restore, because one thing that we are sure of is that the native ecosystems do it better as a whole. They holistically work together. Their ecosystem services are more beneficial, and ecosystem services in general are services that don't just provide to humans. they're services that are benefiting the entire ecosystem. So yeah, trees might be great for lumber, or these trees might be great habitat for like one species of bird or something like that. But overall, if they had never been established in the first place, there would be a significantly higher amount of biodiversity in these areas. So I think that this is a great topic and a great episode, and I think it went very well and opens up a lot of possibilities and discussion.
Right. Yeah, it's all relative and it's all complicated, right? Of course, this is what we see. So, I mean, you could find 300 species of birds in a eucalyptus forest. Like I went birding once with a friend here and we saw like 70 in a day, and it was kind of in a mixed native and eucalyptus forest, but there is a huge bird diversity in Ecuador. So, like what is relative? Like yeah, we can slap some numbers around and whatever, say that it's great, but we don't know what it the potential that's there is so much more, you know. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I think that was great. I'm sorry for not giving anybody a clear answer. I hope you weren't here for a a yes or no, because it was a little bit complicated. But I super enjoyed looking into this topic. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out. We've had a couple people reach out to us before with some different questions, with some memes recently, which was lovely. But we want to hear more from everybody. So we're there. Our inboxes are open, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover.